back to the Stoa, third session of Worldview Studies, an inverse course on sense making and sense breaking the worldviews that shape our world. Um, Hope everyone had a great week. Happy Halloween. Um, Before we begin, I wanted to share some happenings that are coming up at the Stoa, which I'm quite excited about and related to this series. So, there's this individual I'm working with who's doing this really cool startup called Head On, and the idea is like to bridge the meta perspectival gap. And it's like a conversational platform that uses AI. And I work with him as a philosophical counselor, and he's going to come to the Stoa, and he's going to present, share the sort of the challenge he has about bridging the gap, and then we're going to source the collective wisdom at the Stoa. And this has explicitly been talked about in this series, so I thought I'd share it, and I imagine you'll get something out of it. And Adam, who's the philosopher builder, will as well. And we also just launched a new inverse course starting mid November on wise agency. So it's not everyone's talking about high agency, how to be highly agentic, but you can be a highly agentic fool. So how do we cultivate wise agency and how do we cultivate it together? And we have some excellent speakers, so you can check that out. And yeah, I'm so excited to have today's session. To recap the series, if you recall, first week, Rena presented on the 500-year vibe shift. And then last week, Gary was here with Jordan Hall, who presented from a meta-Christian perspective, the three narratives fighting for the soul of humanity. And they were transhumanism, ethnopaganism, and the universal sacred. And today we have Simon, who is doing a similar presentation, presenting on three narratives he sees competing for our mental real estate. So it'll be the same format as last time. Simon will present, we'll do a Q&A, and then we'll turn off the recording and we'll may stay in the main room if enough people are here, or we'll split up into two. So that being said, I'm going to give Simon access to share his screen. Uh, Simon, welcome back to the Stoa, and the floor is yours.
Thanks for having me. I'm going to attempt to get the screen sharing going. All right. Welcome, everyone. I think I want to start by saying that next time I do one of these, I want to hire Jerome as my stylist. So a little bit about the liminal lens. I started the liminal lens as a Substack about 6 months ago. There's a little bit of a journey of discovery, and that journey took me to the Stoa and to Peter. So I'm very excited to be here. My first essay was a musing on quantum mechanics, and since then I've kind of branched out into more philosophical work. In terms of my background, I have a kind of strange background. I started out in philosophy, shifted to cognitive psychology, and from there to manufacturing engineering. And the reason I mention that is that I'm going to explore some different stances with you today. And I think a lot of how I view that is living and experiencing these very different worlds throughout my life, where I was very immersed in philosophy for a while. Then I was very immersed in kind of social sciences and psychology. And then I was very immersed in the sort of practical world of, heavy industrial manufacturing. And so this kind of gave me a sense for different flavors along the way. So I'm going to, this is a link. This QR code is a link to today's presentation, which will give you some of the embeds. If you do scan it now, I just encourage you not to read ahead. But it will give you access to this presentation. Will just be live afterwards. So, and I also know that Peter's recording, but this will give you access to the document and the links. And comments are enabled. So one of the thoughts I had was I kind of want to workshop this with all of you. So once you've got the link, you should be able to comment on different pages with questions, comments, observations. And as we go through it, I think you'll see that some of this is a little bit still work in progress for me. I suspect it's the nature of this topic that it's permanently a work in progress. Long after we're all gone, it'll still be a work in progress, this kind of thought process that we go through together. So the essay that inspired this was an essay that I wrote a few months ago that I've misspelled here, called The Perilous Dance of Philosophy and Power. I love the art of David, and the essay begins with a description of the death of Socrates, who was essentially forced to drink poison for philosophy. And I thought this was just a really apt place to start, because we think of philosophy of this kind of ivory tower, kind of somewhat abstract, somewhat fun exercise. And yet throughout history, it's been this incredibly dangerous pursuit at times for leading philosophers and participants. And it's either been personally dangerous for them, as in the case of Socrates, and I write about this in the essay, but also quite dangerous for society. And so I want to unpack that a little bit and explore that with you. So, why is philosophy dangerous? So the simplest articulation of this, I think I can say, is that the ideas, and particularly philosophical ideas, because they exist at the root of knowledge, they have this tremendous ability, especially when these deep root kind of source code type ideas shift, they have this tremendous ability to reorder societies. And so what can start out as kind of this philosophical musings can clash with power. And so this painting here is a great example of that. This is the arrest of Robespierre during the Thermidorian reaction during the French Revolution. So what began as kind of these esoteric writings of the philosophes, gave way to the French Revolution, led to the rise of Robespierre, and then the reactionaries came along and said, actually, this is too chaotic, and he was arrested and put to death. Jean-Jacques Rousseau was the core inspiration for the French Revolution. For those of you who are not familiar with it, and even those who are, he was one of the core inspirations. And basically, in France, prior to the revolution, they were existing in this kind of Leviathan world where everything, all power and authority was predicated on the divine right of kings. And so from God to King Louis, and from King Louis as sovereign to the people. And Rousseau presented this rather radical notion that the people were sovereign, which immediately created a problem, by the way, which we're going to go into, which is, if the people are sovereign and the people are numerous and somewhat fractious, how do we determine the will of the people? It's pretty easy when it's vested in one man or one family to determine the will of the sovereign. But when the sovereign is distributed through the people, we need some sort of mechanism to determine what that is. And that was the general will. And it was actually the contests over how to discern the general will that led to all the violence, most of the violence during the revolution. And ultimately, in the short term, it was a failed experiment in the sense that sovereignty was revested in Napoleon because they couldn't figure out how to determine and operate this concept of the general will. And so they went from a monarch to an emperor, and it took them quite some time and quite a few cycles. And arguably that's still going on even to this day. So at the beginning, it seemed kind of simple, right? It's like Louis the tyrant, the people are sovereign, kill the tyrant, kind of job done. But as we saw through history, it wasn't quite that simple. I think going into it, in the euphoria of sort of identifying this scapegoat and the euphoria of all these philosophical ideas that had yet to be tested by reality, it seemed kind of simple, but it wasn't. And so I want to dive a little bit deeper now into, why I think that happened then, but also why it keeps happening over and over again. Because if you look at what's going on both in philosophy and politics, we kind of have these two questions that keep recurring. What is reality? What is the nature of reality that we live in? And then, but also, how should we live? Like, what should we do? What is the good life? And it turns out, I believe, for structural reasons, that it's absolutely impossible to separate these questions. So what begins as explorations of the nature of reality inevitably run into these questions of how we should live. And people who begin with questions of how we should live inevitably run into questions of what is the nature of reality. And so it doesn't really matter which polarity you begin. We fail to disentangle these questions, and I don't even view it as a failure. I kind of view it as part of the answer to what is reality, to say that teleology and ontology are not actually separate. I'm going to skim over that today, but I'm planning on doing some follow-up work on Stephen Wolfram's New Physics that gets into that much deeper. So you've kind of got teleology at one end, you've got ontology at the other end. Ontology, the nature of reality; teleology, what should we do? What's our purpose? And then you've kind of got epistemology in the middle, which is, how do we know what we know? But it turns out you can't really directly access ontological truth without some sort of epistemological framework, as if it wasn't complicated enough already. And so what we tend to see is a lot of the fault lines and battlegrounds, both philosophical and political, even if ontology is behind it, these tend to be teleological battles around what is the right, good, virtuous action, and epistemological ones about how do we know what's true, and how does that inform our actions. So this is kind of how I think about it. So you've got ontology and epistemology, which is typically the arena of philosophy concerned with the nature of being, and also the method for uncovering that reality. And this tends to produce fault lines throughout history, but especially now, which we're going to get into, from sort of the notion that reality is constructed by mind. So our minds, or our culture, or our collective mind, sort of constructs our reality at one extreme, and that's a very extreme view. And then at the other extreme, that there's this fundamental underlying kind of true reality that is revealed or given to us in various ways. And that certainly can be appearing in certain forms of religion, but it also appears in non-religious belief systems. And then, so that's typically the domain of philosophy. And then the domain of politics is, what should we do? What you tend to find, and again, I'm sort of flattening this a bit here, but the fault line around this tends to be, are we going to just efficiently repeat existing forms because those forms are the true people, the true society? Or are we going to constantly pursue the generative emergence of new coherence? And so you tend to see a lot of political disagreement kind of exist on that axis. The problem is that you can't separate these two domains. And that's where philosophy gets dangerous and political, and politics can get philosophical. Peter, do we have any questions so far, or that I need to answer, or how's the pacing for everyone?
Yeah, we'll take questions at the end. So if you have any questions, pop them in the chat, and then after Simon's presentation, you can ask your question.
Okay, great. So let's talk about some more recent sort of philosophical stances or positions that we've seen. So I would say in the post-war era, um, this movement of logical positivism was trying to create a kind of epistemological Swiss Army knife, rather, to get at truth. So they were trying to find a universal method for finding what is true. And I think this was kind of the high watermark of post World War II. Um, I would say like bureaucratic. Um, I'm losing the word now. There's a word that's on the tip of my tongue, but essentially, we could kind of have this universal litmus test, empirical litmus test, and through this, we could all just agree on what was true. And if we could agree on what was true, I think there was a, maybe not stated, but behind this was the idea that this litmus test can give us what's true, and therefore it can give us a reasonable expectation that we can agree on what we must do. And so even though, logical positivism was this sort of attempt at the sort of ultimate social scientific toolkit for society, technocratic, that's the word I was looking for. This is like the dream of technocracy, right? You can find the truth, you can use empirical methods to determine what is true. And then out of that, you can create wise policy and social harmony. So, I mean, you could see why this was appealing to people. It had a nice ring to it. And unfortunately, it collapsed almost as soon as it was completed. It collapsed from a few different dimensions in very rapid succession. So in the 1950s, Willard Quine wrote Two Dogmas of Empiricism. And I go into this more in the essay, but essentially, what Quine was saying is, well, there's no theory neutral fact. Every fact is constructed within theories, ingoing theories that you have. So even your construction of your empirical tests is theory laden. I like to refer to this as that there's no view from nowhere. Every view is from somewhere, right? And if you're the one doing the viewing or the speaking, then ultimately the source of where that view is coming from is you. So this kind of technocratic harmony suddenly starts to look really wobbly and really shaky almost as soon as the project is complete. And this is what Rena spoke about with Thomas Kuhn's book, The Structure of Scientific Revolution. So taking Quine's work and kind of extending it, Kuhn said, well, there are these kind of shared belief systems. So you could say like intersubjective groupings within science that kind of agree on a certain set of foundations for scientific work, but periodically these break apart. And that's what scientific revolutions are. So you're kind of taking what Quine has said and taking it even further and saying that there are these socio-cultural groups that exist within science. And I don't want to call them hegemonic, but there are definitely scientific hegemonies that emerge, even if that wasn't the intention of the original people. But that periodically these are kind of dethroned through an accumulation of contradiction within, often it's that the theories, the core theories, can no longer describe what's happening around them in the world or empirical evidence, and so they start to break down. And it gets worse. And this was actually, shout out to my first essay here about Schrodinger's cat. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Schrodinger's cat, but it turned out that even within physics at the most profound level, at the quantum level, which is, kind of one of the deepest levels we've gotten to in experimental physics, there's just this notion that there's no reality outside of perception. There's a link here to that original. That's a very short essay, but I would say you've got to read the original Schrodinger's cat before looking at the essay. So I think we've kind of been on this long march towards and through, relativity. This is the kind of Copernican model, sort of pre-Copernicus, man in his relationship with God was the center of the universe. And then obviously Copernicus said, well, wait a minute, it's actually kind of heliocentric. Like, we revolve around the sun, the universe doesn't revolve around us. And ever since then, our horizons have been expanding out kind of further and further. And this can be quite disorienting for all of us, because there's this sense in which everything exists in relationship to everything else. There's no substrate. And I would say even Einstein's relativity, even though Einstein kind of identified this thought that, everything exists relative to everything else in this, he couldn't quite fully get his head around it. And so physics posited this substrate of space-time, which almost sort of immediately contradicts the premise of general and special relativity. And I'd say it's only relatively recently that Stephen Wolfram has taken relativity and repostulated it without the need for this kind of pre-existing substrate. That's a separate thing, so that's a rabbit hole I don't want to go down. But so if you're feeling a little disoriented now, I know I am when I think about this stuff for too much time. I think it can be quite disorienting, especially this kind of current moment that we're at. And so, with the collapse of logical positivism and the collapse of what I would say is like sort of the historical movement of kind of positivist empiricism, you have a few different efforts to try and reinterpret what this means for us now. And I know Gary talked about this, the kind of the three worldviews, fighting for the human soul. And so I'm going to give you my take on those three worldviews, what they are, how they interact, and how I look at them, in the hope that might be helpful to some of you and how you look at them. How are we doing for time, Peter? Great. So the first one is not just Bayes' theorem, but the whole notion of kind of Bayesian epistemology, right? Which is essentially, we may not be able to determine absolute truth, but as a practical matter, we can at least get less bad answers. So we don't have to completely give up on the notion that you can look at evidence and reach reasonable conclusions that can give you an idea about how the world works, and how, and by implication, how we might want to live, right? And I would say this area definitely gives you more around how the world works and leaves it more up to you on sort of how you want to live. But they basically said, it's not a problem that you can't discern the absolute truth from empiricism. You can just sort of have less bad answers, and you'll never reach the absolute truth because there's no such thing, which is what Quine and Kuhn have asserted. But you can at least get closer to reality, whatever that is. And there's different flavors, I think, of Bayesianism. There are some that just say, this is just our best effort, kind of practical stance. And then I think there are some approaches that say, actually, there is such a thing as scientific realism. It's just it's observer dependent and approximate, and it is constrained by where we exist in the universe as an observer. And I would say that's where Wolfram is. I would say Wolfram is a scientific realist who accepts that we can only view the universe from where we sit. And so even if there are fundamental rules, we can't expect to necessarily be able to see them, and certainly not perfectly. We can only perceive them dimly, um, and so we can approach reality, but we can never, there's no point of arrival. I wrote at the bottom, does not work well with psychopathy or cluster B personalities, because this whole model kind of assumes, I think, a level of intersubjective honesty between human beings in order to operate. Like if you're operating within a sort of psychopathic framework, you tend to filter your outputs towards your perceived sort of personal advantage. So it makes it really difficult to operate effectively as a group, certainly within this framework. And I would argue that things like psychopathy tend to infect cultures where there is Bayesianism and lead to a lot of bad outcomes. And one of the bad outcomes is the kind of discrediting of this whole methodology, or variants of this methodology, because of the presence of psychopathy or cluster B personalities. So that's one stance. There was another stance that arose in the 50s and 60s and has many different flavors. So if Bayesianism was a sort of a practical fallback for empiricists, postmodernism and its kind of political wing, which is critical theory, basically said, okay, there's no view from nowhere, there's no absolute truth. Therefore, we're going to treat knowledge as a purely social construct and a social control mechanism. Basically, everything, certainly speech, all speech is power, and all power is socially constructed. And that's the kind of postmodernist. I mean, I'm horribly simplifying here, but I go into more detail in the essay. But that's essentially the kind of postmodernist critical theory worldview. This, to me, invites a couple of questions. I think within this postmodernist view and sort of rejection of all narratives and a sort of flattening of everything to power dynamics, I do see some formalistic returns to old religious patterns via postmodernism, even though postmodernism tends to claim, in most cases, not always, to be atheistic. You see a lot of callbacks within postmodernist and critical theory movements to some very old sort of religious habits. The notion of the Protestant work ethic notion of sort of liberation anxiety and purity tests and original sin. And that's probably, again, a separate essay, but all these themes, I think, recur in postmodernism in really interesting ways. I haven't fully developed that thinking, but I see it. I also see within postmodernism often the scapegoat mechanism that René Girard talks about as a sort of pre-Christian, sort of paganistic religious practice. I see overtones of that here as well. I'm probably sounding like I'm being very negative on postmodernism. I actually, in the essay, I see some interesting aspects to it, but I would need to be honest here and say that various strands and fragments of postmodernist and critical theory thought, I think, have created a lot of problems for us, and we can go into that later. So then there's the third stance, which is broadly speaking, the traditionalist stance. Nassim Taleb, who I really enjoy reading, has this thing that he didn't invent this, the Lindy effect, which is essentially like the longer something has been around, the more likely it is to be robust and battle-tested and true. And so I think, I think postmodernism, which has grown so much in the last 50 to 70 years, I do think we're seeing this kind of return to the Lindy effect, that even if some of the ideas behind postmodernism kind of made sense intellectually, I think for a lot of people, it's felt like this kind of trip down the garden path and a lot of untested ideas. And the Lindy effect basically says, I mean, Taleb famously only drinks water, wine, and coffee or tea, right? Because he's like, well, these beverages have been around for like a really long time, so they're probably not going to kill me. Um, and so I think this is an increasingly, not just Lindy, but traditionalism in all its forms is increasingly appealing to people because they're seeing all this kind of cultural churn around postmodernist ideas, and it feels very disorienting, and people are trying to get back to something that feels a lot more stable to them. So in the essay, I kind of drew this map. This is definitely a work in progress. But I tried to show kind of the main groupings of thinkers around these attractor basins. I sort of think of them as attractor basins. I don't think any of them are perfectly non-porous with each other or the outside world. So there's so many different flavors of this, and they tend to kind of run into each other. But you can see, broadly speaking, there's a movement of civilizational traditionalists of various kinds. Modi is sort of a Hindu version of that. Bannon is a Western, sort of macro Western version of that. Tommy Robinson is an English specifically kind of version of that. And then you have the kind of the Bayesians who tend to cluster in engineering businesses in Silicon Valley. People like Mark Andreessen, who I think believe in progress, but they believe in just rapid testing of ideas and sort of evolutionary process through that. And then there are theoreticians like Tetlock and these other kind of theoreticians within that. And then you've kind of got the postmodernist new left that kind of runs from Foucault to Crenshaw. And then a lot of politicians are kind of the active wing of this movement. Some at the more kind of local level, like Chesa Boudin in San Francisco, and some at the national level, like Elizabeth Warren. And then outside of these core groupings, you tend to have people who kind of are maybe a bit more, their philosophy is less clear. They tend to kind of exist on the fringes of these things without fully embracing these kind of systems of thought. You can see kind of the liberal establishment and the establishment right. I would argue that these were actually quite pragmatic groupings that tried not to be too philosophically purist. So they were influenced by these ideas, but they weren't looking for sort of purity in execution so much as just kind of muddling through. So I think until relatively recently, a lot of political activity was kind of just different forms of management that were informed by these different philosophical viewpoints, but not necessarily cleanly or perfectly so. And we can come back to that. So that was a very complicated diagram. So I'm trying to work on something a bit simpler. And I do think you can kind of broadly view epistemology as sort of on this broad spectrum from received to constructed. And you can broadly view teleology or purpose from sort of performative to generative. And when I say performative, I don't necessarily mean that bad. I just mean the faithful repetition of that which is efficient or correct, versus generative tends to be a sort of more of a voyage of discovery into the unknown. So I don't necessarily view this word performative in the negative sense in which it often appears in popular culture. And I think you can kind of find these kind of broad groupings then appearing in the quadrants when you when you put the sort of the epistemological axis of received to constructed on one axis, and the sort of the teleological and sort of this performative worldview that we need to put sort of conduct the correct performance in order to achieve the good outcome, versus this kind of voyage of discovery, kind of generative approach, which is everything's always in beta, everything's a work in progress. And interestingly, if you look at the bottom half of this chart, where we're in the area of sort of received epistemology, I think you can, even between the traditionalists and the transcendentalists, you can almost see a fault line just within different religious traditions too in the bottom half. So yeah, the traditionalists tend to be more sort of ritualistic and performative of the correct way to commune with God, whereas the transcendentalists tend to pursue a more generative, personal, individualized, not necessarily organized approach to communing with and perceiving God, even if that is a received and not a constructed process. And then, on the constructed end of things, you have these radically different views. So above the line here, between the postmodernists and the Bayesians, about how one goes about constructing reality. Is it a intersubjective voyage of discovery, this kind of, empirical fallback position of the Bayesians, or is everything power and it's all just this giant social process? Like everything is social, everything is power oriented. It's all about creating groups to seize power and sort of forging alliances, which I would argue is more the postmodernist and critical theory kind of worldview. I'm going to propose something, and I have a QR code here. David Chapman has a wonderful blog called Meaningness, in which he attempts to create the case for what he calls the meta-rational stance. That quote's not from him. The quote's from George Box. All models are wrong, but some are useful. But I think it's useful in understanding Chapman. I think Chapman would say we have something to learn from all of these quadrants. And the trick is to not get stuck in any of them too much, to be able to appreciate, almost like putting on and taking off different glasses, which is why I probably wanted Jerome to style me today. You can kind of put on or take off these different lenses and play around with viewing the world through these different lenses, and you can learn something from the experience each time without necessarily having to flatten the world and say, this is the definitive statement on reality. Because I think what we've learned from the collapse of logical positivism is that there is no definitive stance on reality. There are just different lenses and views that we can take. So does teleology always win? This is a bit of a silly ending, but I think unfortunately what you see is that at a certain point of philosophical disruption, action, and sometimes violent action, as we saw in the French Revolution, just kind of puts paid to these deeper explorations of the nature of reality. And I think that's sad when humanity has to experience that. Teleology should be this dominant force over our epistemological understanding. In an ideal world, we're all free to explore the nature of reality, and from that, explore the nature of the good. Okay, I don't know how I did for time there.
Yeah, that's perfect. Great job, Simon. Everyone give him a round of applause.
Thank you.
I'm going to stop your sharing. We got some great questions. Keep them coming. I'm going to ask two myself, and then we might go 10, 15 minutes after the hour. So when I looked at that chart with the worldviews or the attractor Bayesians, it's like it seems, and let me know if you think this is accurate, but in like the tech and business world, the Bayesians seem to be dominating.
Yes.
And then the culture, the postmodernists, and then politics, it looks like the traditionalists are making a run for it, pushing out perhaps the positivist technocrats. Um, yeah, so what do you think of that analysis assessment? Do you think that's accurate? Those are the ways, the domains that they're dominating?
I would agree. I think they're all contested spaces, though, so they're constantly contesting. Um, but yes, broadly, yes, I would agree.
And you mentioned that the collapse of the logical positivists, which could be represented, I imagine, by the technocrats. Um, do you see them still in the game, though? Maybe just not like they don't have full spectrum dominance, but they're a contender.
I think they became the Bayesians. So I think that Bayesianism and scientific realism was an attempt to salvage the technocratic project whilst accepting that there's no view from nowhere. Um, uh, yeah,
All right, cool. Um, so we got some great questions. Adam, let's take you in first.
Yeah, so I am not a philosopher except for like survival, just trying to understand reality. But I've always seen the basis of philosophy framed as ontology, epistemology, axiology. I've never seen it framed with teleology, so that made me like stop and be like, whoa, because I think the problem with our modern world is we've like chopped off two of Aristotle's causes, right? So like we just think, with kind of the scientific paradigm, there's just like material and efficient causes, and we don't think about formal and final. You're already going to teleology. I'm like, whoa, that's like a major concession. Like we're already saying that the Enlightenment project is like totally flawed. So I'm just curious, like, why you went right to teleology, like if you can kind of expand on
yeah.
that.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the reason I went there was because my premise for the whole thing was that philosophy doesn't stay in the bottle, that it always escapes the bottle and clashes with politics, and that politics is the zone in which teleology is fought. So I'm sorry, I'm going to move. I had surgery 2 days ago, so I'm going to try and sit in a more comfortable chair. Um, so yeah, um, so I think you look at these philosophical movements, and they always end up mingling in very dramatic ways throughout history with politics and religion. And so by introducing teleology there, I was trying to show that how that mingling takes place. I also think there's a deeper level at which, and this is probably another talk for another day, um, but sort of within sort of post quantum mechanics physics, if you look at Stephen Wolfram, you start and his work, you start to say, well, maybe we're in a process universe. And so at a very deep level, if we're in a process universe and not everyone accepts that, then there may not even be a real theoretical distinction between teleology and ontology, because if there's no objects, there's just processes. Did that answer it?
Yeah. So like kind of like Whitehead, that kind of process philosophy,
Yes.
that sort of thing. Yeah. So I mean, but I guess that's like a major thing to me because it's like we're totally like affirming that the Enlightenment paradigm is just not working for us anymore.
Um, would I go that far? I Yeah, possibly. I need to think about that some more because I don't think we have to throw it all out. But it's certainly limited. I think we've reached the limits. Should we say that? We've reached the limits.
Yes, no, and I guess that's what I'm getting at, is like we're having to retrieve formal and final causes to like better explain reality.
Yes. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Adam. Shingai, you had a question.
Yeah. So my question is about the Venn diagram, and I'm curious where you might place the systems theorists and cyberneticists on that diagram.
Ooh,
Do you
good
think they tend
question.
to ally with or fall neatly within one of those philosophical camps? Are they own their own fringe group on the border? Any thoughts on that?
I don't know, but you now have access to commenting, and I would love you to mark it up with your thoughts on that.
Okay, will do.
And feel free to share them now. I don't, you know what's funny though? I chuckled when you said that because somewhat, and I don't know if this is like a revelatory moment, but I kind of place myself somewhere in that group, maybe.
Cool.
So the fact that
Yeah.
I didn't even map them is quite telling.
Yeah, I definitely identify with that group, and I sort of have an impulse to like place myself in the middle, but I don't know how honest that is, so I'll have to give it some thought.
I would love everyone your markup on the document. You should be able to comment and you know, and my goal is to I don't know if any of you ever saw Venkatesh Rao's greater ribbon from cultural map, but my goal is to take these diagrams in 2x2s and turn them into something like that out of this process with all of you. So thank you.
Yep.
What do we got? Dan, did you have a question? Yeah.
Yeah, my internet's a little spotty, so I'm gonna keep my camera off. My question actually is kind of around maybe the dissemination of ideas. A form of we had capitalism. Looking at the postmodernists, specifically, I think you mentioned Leotard.
I did,
They
yeah.
comment that the spread of ideas and the imagery and the dissemination as who can do it the fastest, like who can get to the moon the fastest, may actually just really be two powers creating rockets to murder people, and they're using rockets as a symbol, right? But like the idea is competing to spread across the world, who can do it faster, the Marxists or the capitalists?
Mm.
Do you think that these postmodernists are truly just a creation of a cyclical pattern of hegemony throughout history, and we're just still kind of trapped in that cycle?
Ooh, it's a good question. Do you? I hate to do this to you, Dan, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on it before responding, because I suspect you have a thought on it. But if you don't, I'm happy to go first.
No, I certainly do. I'm kind of going through Richard Barbrook's book about thinking machines to the global village, the
Yeah,
great kind of techno pessimist book, and
yeah,
he claims that the World's Fair, let's use the World's Fair,
yeah.
like all these great ideas were just a way to establish precedents for America to take the lead and just run with it. And once the net was created, it was basically game over for the rest of the world, and the rest of the world was forced to follow capitalism. So these postmodernists were caught in the sweep and said, okay, the paradigm shift is that hegemony from the American side, the capitalist side, collected all the right thinkers, put them towards IBM, put it towards the rocket creation, put it towards AI early stages, and we're forced into this cycle through American hegemony, which is just an extension of prior forms of political thought.
Well, this is where I like the postmodernists, because they're right to view they're right to view major world events through the lens of power and power competition. I just think they take it way too far, where they reduce everything to power. So I'm not surprised that postmodernist thought, for example, flattens eroticism, because just power-based relationships where it's all just about who's in control is very like anti-erotic. So um I like postmodernist lenses, and I could see how what you've just said is a great piece of postmodernist analysis. But I think, to my point about Chapman and meta rationality, I think if you if you sort of just become like laser focused on that, and you don't look through other meta-rational lenses, you might miss important parts of the story. I have no idea if that answered the question, but
No, I like that. That's good.
All right, thanks, Dan. We might sneak in one or two more questions. Richard, you had a question on the establishment, right and left.
Yes. In one of your slides, you had a Venn diagram,
yes.
And the establishment right and the liberal establishment were not part of the worldviews discussed. So I'm curious if you can outline the basic worldview of both establishments. I'm not from the US, so I'm curious to hear about that.
Yeah, I find the legacy establishment worldviews somewhat tough to discern, which is why I left them outside. I think that they're certainly adjacent to these views, but they tend to be that I think this is where human psychology comes in. I think their stated positions and their lived behaviors tend not to align. And a lot of the establishment folks sort of look like people who might just want to be in Congress because they enjoy an information advantage in order to make money in the markets. And that's not a particularly, to the extent that that happens, and I can't point to individuals, but we can say in aggregate, we have data that happens in aggregate, that if you are in Congress, you make way more money than you should in the stock market and get rich. So, you know, my sense is that they have personal motives, and that even if they claim to be aligned with these groups, that their motives are a little bit more idiosyncratic and personal. And so I put them sort of adjacent to these groups. But then you get someone like Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders, who I think, whether you agree with them or not, they are trying to be more philosophically consistent with these kind of core philosophical groupings. And so it's somewhat arbitrary who gets to live inside the Venn diagram and who's outside. And I think some people are outside, like the cypherpunks are outside just because they're like Groucho Marx, like, you know, like, I don't want to be part of any club that would have me as a member, you know. So the cypherpunks just, they want to be outside, a lot of them. And the ones who want to be inside aren't real cypherpunks anymore. So I don't know if that answered your question, but that's how I kind of have fun with it.
Yeah, thank you.
And how would you like the establishment, left or right, in relationship to like logical positivism? How do you see them connect to that?
Yeah, that's a good question. This actually speaks to the upstream downstream thing. So one of the things that I get at in some of my essays that I didn't go into today is like sort of pure adherence and discussion of these ideas is a relatively minority sport, right? Like not many people have the time or interest to do it. So by the time you get to the politicians, it's been filtered through sort of societal political power mechanics. So it has to be diluted by the time it gets there. So that's part of also perhaps why their relationship is not always that clear, because and actually, if you go back to my 2x2, and you know, I talked about sort of the religious divide between the sort of traditionalist religion, the performative religion, and the kind of almost like you know, what did I call it? More sort of, you know, meditate your way alone to religious insight kind of group. I kind of view it a little bit like that too. I might have lost my point there, but
And did you mention or place it in your chart, the professional managerial class? Like, how would you see them? Like, are they close to the establishment, left and right? Because they still seem like they're a power hub, and they're have a little different than the Bayesians.
yeah, that's really interesting. I view them as a downstream sort of hodgepodge of whatever philosophical ideas tend to be in vogue. So I might even put them in the middle of the Venn, but not but not as like the perfect synthesis of three dichotomous branches of thought, but more as a kind of like, by the time it's gotten to the PMC, it's all sort of just cultural, sort of philosophical thoughts that have filtered through culture, and they've filtered, and you sort of end up with this kind of coffee and cream and sugar. That's the best analogy I can come up with. It's like all three ingredients are there. It's not quite clear how they sort of cohere, but the PMC are trying to manage any major cultural force that is going to impinge on their ability to do their job and make a living and look after their family. They're going to try and take that on board, right? So you certainly see that with management fads. Different management fads kind of come and go. They don't necessarily have to be philosophically purely adhering to any one of these groups. And so I think the real conflict takes place between the core adherents of these groups, because they're trying to the previous question that I got, they're trying to push more and more of their ideas. It's like more coffee, less cream, less sugar. If you can get the PMC to adopt more coffee, less cream, less sugar, then Team Coffee is ahead. I don't know if that makes sense as an answer.
Yeah, that's imagine we can take that into the collective inquiry.
Yeah.
So we'll pause here. Simon, any kind of broad thoughts that came up from the questions, or anything else you'd like to share with us before we go to the collective presencing portion?
These were great questions, and I apologize if I didn't have clear answers to them. I think that just shows that we're trying to condense, multi-generations of human thought into the current moment, and sort of, the question always on my mind is where do we go next? So I think I had a question about the systems theorists and the cyberneticists, and so we haven't even talked about where we go next, really. But that's, why did I unabandon philosophy, having abandoned it 25 years ago, which I did, and start writing this stuff? And it's because, to me, suddenly it's like, oh, where do we go next? That to me is so important right now.
I think I'm gonna match that question for our inquiry. Where do we go next? So let's take a 5-minute break. If you feel called to slip out, you can. And if we have more than 30 people, we'll do 2 groups. Under 30, we'll do 1. So yeah, we'll take a 5-minute break now.